Okay. Our verse today is Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 2, Chapter 1, Text 7. At least that's what I believe it is. I looked at the chart that Hari Vilas sent around, and I believe that's the correct verse. And this verse is about the idea of hearing about the Supreme, which is different than hearing about other things. Hearing about the Supreme is in a special category, all by itself. So let's go then to our text for today, 2.1.7. Prayena munayo rajan nivritta vidi shedhataha naigunya staramante sma gunanu katane harehe. Prayena munayo rajan nivritta vidi shedhataha Nirgunyastharamante sma gunanu katane harehe. And the word meanings are prayena, mainly, munayaha, all sages, rajan, O king, nivrittaha, above, vidihi, regulative principles, shedhataha, from restrictions, nirgunya staha, transcendently situated, ramante, takes pleasure in, sma, distinctly, guna anukatane, describing the glories, harehe, of the Lord. O King Parikshit, mainly the topmost transcendentalists who are above the regulative principles and restrictions take pleasure in describing the glories of the Lord. O King Parikshit, mainly the topmost transcendentalists who are above the regulative principles and restrictions take pleasure in describing the glories of the Lord. So the purport: the topmost transcendentalist is a liberated soul and is therefore not within the purview of regulative principles. A neophyte who is intended to be promoted to the spiritual plane is guided by the spiritual master under regulative principles. He may be compared to a patient who is treated by various restrictions under medical jurisdiction. Generally, liberated souls also take pleasure in describing the transcendental activities. As mentioned above, since Narayan, Hari, the personality of God, it is beyond the material creation, his form and attributes are not material. The topmost transcendentalists, or the liberated souls, realize him by advanced experience of transcendental knowledge, and therefore they take pleasure in the discussion of the transcendental qualities of the Lord's pastimes. In Bhagavad Gita, chapter 4, text 9, the personality of Godhead declares his appearance and activities are all divyam, or transcendental. The common man, who is under the spell of material energy, takes it for granted that the Lord is like one of us, and therefore he refuses to accept the transcendental nature of the Lord's form, name, etc. The topmost transcendentalist is not interested in anything material, and his taking interest in the matter of the Lord's activities is definite proof that the Lord is not like one of us in the material world. In the Vedic literatures also, it is confirmed that the Supreme Lord is one, but that he is engaged in his transcendental pastimes in the company of his unalloyed devotees, and that simultaneously he is present as the Supersoul, an expansion of Baladev in the heart of all living entities. Therefore, the highest perfection of The transcendental realization is to take pleasure in hearing and describing the transcendental qualities of the Lord, and not in merging into his impersonal Brahman existence, for which the impersonal monist aspires. Real transcendental pleasure is realized in the glorification of the transcendental Lord, and not in the feeling of being situated in his impersonal feature. But there are also others who are not the topmost transcendentalists, but are in a lower status, and who do not take pleasure in the transcendental activities of the Lord. Rather, they discuss such activities of the Lord formally, with the aim of merging into his existence. Prayena munayo rajan nivritta vidis shedhataha naigunyas taramante sma gunanu katane harehe. O King Parikshit, mainly the topmost transcendentalists who are above the regulative principles and restrictions take pleasure in describing the glories of the Lord. So, right away, this verse kind of gives us an indirect indication that impersonalism is not the real goal of spiritual life, because it talks about describing the glories of the Lord. If actually the impersonal was the most important aspect of the Supreme, then what would be the purpose of describing his various pastimes or his features or his qualities? What would be the point in it? There could not be any point in it. And here it makes this point that topmost transcendentalists, they take pleasure in describing the glories of the Lord. So to describe the glories of the Lord, we have to talk about what he looks like, what he does, what his qualities are. And he has these various pastimes, all of which are absent in the Brahman, or the impersonal aspect. The Brahman is effulgent white light. So once you say that the effulgence, or the Brahman, is eternal, white light, unchangeable, then there's not much more you can say about it. There's nothing else to it. You know, it has no forms, no pastimes. Its qualities are essentially just that it's eternal, all-pervading, undifferentiated. Once you enumerate a handful of those kind of qualities, there's nothing more to say about it. So only lower realization transcendentalists will be attracted to this form. And this is what Prabhupada is saying in the purport that we just read. This is, as we've been describing here, a very interesting canto full of all kinds of things. And, we are right now talking about the importance of hearing about the Supreme. But Prabhupada brought up some different important ideas, and these ideas were there to, I'm going to talk a little bit about them. We talked about last week a bit, and I'll bring it back again before our eyes. The divisions of creation, since this chapter has a lot to do about creation. There is what's called the Mahakalpa, which is the Supreme Lord as Mahavishnu, breathing out the various bubbles of the thousands, countless of universes, material universes in the material world. Then we have on the far right the creation by Lord Brahma. Here we see Brahma creating various things. Musical forms, different kinds of illusion. He's creating all kinds of different things. So he takes what has been granted by the expansion of Mahavishnu and turns them into finer, assembled, detailed physical forms and gets the whole system of the universe up and running. And in between, we have this thing called the Vikalpa. So there's Mahakalpa, which is the creation by the Supreme Lord. The Kalpa, which is the creation by Lord Brahma, his refinement and conglomeration of the elements left by the Supreme Lord. And in between is Vikalpa, which is the creation of Lord Brahma himself as he is born from the navel of Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. Now, Prabhupada has mentioned how these various expansions come from the Supreme, from Balaram. So before we talk about the expansion of the material world, we can talk about the expansion of the Supreme. So we have from Krishna is expanded Balaram, and from Balaram we have Mahasankarshan. So Mahasankarshan is an expansion from Balaram. A point that I should make here carefully, and it's easily missed, is that when we're talking about the material universe, there is a point in time where there is no material universe, and then Mahavishnu lies down and breathes out the universe. So this does happen in within the scope of a time flow, and it happens recurringly, just as a person breathes in and out. Then Mahavishnu breathes in and out, and when he breathes out, the universes are formed. When he breathes back in, they're annihilated. However, and this is an important point to remember, however, when we talk about Balaram expanding from Krishna, this is not happening within the purview of time. Just as Krishna is eternal, so Balaram is eternal, and so is Mahasankarshan. All these forms are eternal. In fact, we are also eternal. We have always existed. So this is talking about creation in the sense of what's most fundamental, but not in the sense of there was a time when there was only Krishna floating around in the spiritual world with nothing else going on. There was never such a time. Krishna has always existed. But still we say that Krishna is basic, and from him expands the next feature, which is Balaram. Although this doesn't happen at a point in time, we can understand that Balaram is secondary to Krishna. And then we have Mahasankarshan, who's secondary to Balaram, or we could say tertiary to Krishna. And then if we go one step further, we see that from Mahasankarshan comes Mahavishnu, who we've just been talking about. And from Mahavishnu expands Garbhodakshaya Vishnu. And from Garbhodakshaya Vishnu expands Kshirodakshaya Vishnu. It's like a telescope, each thing expanding into the next. And from Kshirodakshaya Vishnu expands Ananta Sesh. But also from Kshirodakshaya Vishnu expands the Supersoul, which Prabhupada mentioned in the verse today. So Prabhupada said that the Supersoul comes from Balaram, but we just see that here is Krishna, then Balaram, then Mahasankarshan. Then we have, here's Mahasankarshan again. Then we have Mahavishnu, Garbhavishnu, and finally Kshirodakshaya Vishnu. And the Supersoul comes from him. So there's some stages in between, but yes, the Supersoul does come ultimately from Balaram. In the second canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, we have two presentations. In general, in the Bhagavatam itself, we have two presentations of the creation system. One presentation is this bubbling out of the universes from Mahavishnu. That's one way we can visualize how the creation happens. A different way that we can visualize how creation happens is this progression of the Mahatat, which comes from the Brahm Jyoti. So in Brahma Samhita, we see that expanded from the Brahma Jyoti is the Mahatat. And the Mahatat is like the Brahma Jyoti. It has no features. And it is in equilibrium. However, when the Supreme Lord glances at it and disturbs the Mahatat, it becomes the Pradhan. And the Pradhan now is starting to get out of equilibrium. It's starting to create various places that are not identical. And the first things generated by the Pradhan is the three modes of nature and the false ego. So the three modes of nature are now the Mahatat in disequilibrium. So when the three modes of nature are activated, that means in some places at some times the mode of goodness is prominent, at some places and sometimes the mode of passion is prominent, and in some places at some times the mode of ignorance is prominent. This is mentioned in Bhagavad Gita. And the false ego has been generated, and it blends with the three modes of nature. And so the false ego blends with the mode of goodness, it blends with the mode of passion, and it blends with the mode of ignorance. And this generates the 24 elements of Sankhya philosophy. So we won't talk more about that because it's complex, but later we will talk about that in future Bhagavatam classes. So here are the universes expanding from Mahavishnu. Mahavishnu is asleep or lying on his serpent bed in the causal ocean, and the universes are bubbling out of his pores and also of his breathing. And here are the other view, the creation of the material elements. We have the gross elements, the subtle sense objects, the knowledge acquiring senses, and the working senses. Each one of these is divided into 5. So the gross elements are earth, air, fire, water. Are ether, air, fire, water, and earth. The subtle sense objects are sound, touch, form, taste, and smell. The knowledge senses are the ears, the skin, the eyes, mouth, and nose. And the working senses are the tongue, anus, belly, genitals, and tongue, arms, belly, genital, and anus, right? So we have beyond that, that's 20 elements. 4 times 5 is 20. So we have 3 more elements, which are called subtle elements: the false ego, the intelligence, and the mind. So we're not going to delve into that today. And then also in the process of creation, we have what are known as the guna avatars. Generally, we see that Brahma, he's in charge of creation, but he's in charge of secondary creation. Vishnu's in charge of the first creation, but he's also in charge of maintenance. And Shiva, he's in charge of destruction of the universes, but he's also in charge of transmitting the living entities into the material world. So these are also different representatives of the Supreme Lord that govern the different modes of nature. So Vishnu's in charge of the mode of goodness, Brahma is in charge of the mode of passion, and Shiva is in charge of the mode of ignorance. So we will hear how the Supreme Lord, as Mahavishnu, has no contact with the material energy. He glances at it. And this glance is called his dim halo, as Bhaktisiddhanta translates it into English in the Brahma Samhita. This dim halo is Shiva. And Shiva then translates or transposes the countless living entities which are coming from the glance of Mahavishnu and seeds them into the material world where they can engage in having bodies and having various karmic episodes. So aside from that, Shiva and his wife Parvati are considered the mistress and master of the material world. They are in charge of it. So today, this is our concept that the Transcendental Lord has pastimes. And understanding them, we can be freed from material nature. Prabhupada quotes this verse, Bhagavad Gita 4.9, Janma karma chamnedibyam evam yo veti tyatvataha tyatvadeham punarjanma naitimamiti Arjuna. One who knows the transcendental nature of my appearance and activities does not, upon leaving the body, take his birth again in the material world, but attains my eternal abode, O Arjuna. So in the 4th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is telling Arjuna that understanding his real nature and his pastimes gives one the possibility to leave the material world forever. So one needs to understand his janma and his karma, his birth and his activities, but understand them properly, not understand them theoretically or not misunderstand them in some way or another. In this way, we can leave the material world permanently. And this is what makes talking about the Supreme, talking about Krishna, talking about his qualities, talking about his pastimes, talking about his devotees, talking about his philosophy. This is what makes it very different than any other kind of activity that we might engage in. We can engage in so many activities. We can talk about so many subject matters. But this subject matter is very different than all other subject matters. And that's why transcendental, perfected people, sages, yogis, devotees, why such transcendentally perfected people still engage in speaking about the Supreme. They don't avoid it. They don't think it's not important, the way Mayavadis or monists might describe it. Rather, they think this is very important. And this is, of course, also again described in the 1st canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, the 7th chapter, verse 10, the famous Atmarama verse, which was discussed by Lord Chaitanya and Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. So this famous Atmaram verse, Sutta Uvacha Atmaramas Chamunayo Nirgranta Apiyarukrame Kurvanti I Hoitukim Bhaktim Itam Bhuta Gano Harihi. Sutta Goswami said, all different varieties of Atmaramas, those who take pleasure in the Atma or spirit self, especially those established on the path of self-realization, though freed from all kinds of material bondage, desire to render unalloyed devotional service under the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This means that the Lord possesses transcendental qualities and therefore can attract everyone, including liberated souls. So this verse 2 gives us an understanding that the personal form of the Supreme is the highest, and that those who claim or are focused on the impersonal feature of the Lord, such people are not actually understanding the Vedas at their deepest essence, because they could not explain why people would want to perform devotional service. If the Brahman or the Brahmajyoti feature is the most important feature, why would you want to perform devotional service? If the Brahman or the Brahmajyoti is the highest feature, why would you describe the Supreme? Because actually we should be describing the Brahmajyoti. If the Brahmajyoti or the impersonal realization was the highest thing, then why would you engage in some kind of service? What would be the point in it? What would you serve and how would you serve? There's nothing to serve in the Brahmajyoti. So this is why we have a very different outlook and why we do not at all have any use for this impersonal viewpoint. We agree that the Supreme Lord does have an all-pervading, non-formal or formless feature. The Supreme Lord does have the formless feature, but that feature is not what interests us. We don't target that aspect of the Supreme with any of our focus, our intention, or our service. Rather, we target the Supreme as the Bhagawan or personal feature. So that's what we're actually interested in. And I'll ask at this point if anyone has any realizations or any questions about what we've discussed so far.
Hare Krishna Maharaj.
Yeah.
I was just thinking that the followers of or the Mayavadis, I mean, our lives are filled with so much activities that are natural to our sanity and upkeep. And, you know, during this crisis of COVID-19, it was so difficult for people to stay inside, you know, and self-quarantine or stay away from a social life. It's hard to figure out, you know, how they can follow philosophy when they really think that you would just be there floating around with nothing to do. I mean, I don't know how that translates to their way of thinking.
Yeah, that's the problem of the Mayavad conception, that there's nothing practical about it as far as real human nature goes. I sometimes tell people that if someone came to you and said, hey, over in the next room, the scientists and various transcendentalists in India got together and they created a machine that permanently merges you with the all-pervading feature. And once you go in there, you disappear forever. And all your problems in the material world are finished. How many people would volunteer to go into the machine? You know, it just strikes me as there's nothing attractive about it, that you depersonalize, you know. If you're really experiencing a rough time in the material world, then you might be drawn to something like that. But for any other reason, I just can't imagine how anybody would be attracted to it. We look at what people commonly do. They have relationships, they engage in pastimes, they're interested in emotions, they like doing things, they like variety. And the Mayavad conception says, no, 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 kick it all out. You know, we don't want variety. We don't want people. We don't want pastimes. We don't want emotions. We don't want any changes. We want things to be the same forever. It, you know, kicks all that out with big boots. So what is attractive about that? You know, unless you're really undergoing a really super bad episode in your material existence, that might seem attractive to what's going on at that moment in time. But to any other person, it just seems like there's nothing at all that seems good about it. And of course, this is true, that the impersonal realization of the Supreme is only attractive to those who do not know anything about the personal feature, or those who have a twisted internal sense of who they are and what God is. There's only those two categories. So people who have never heard of the personal form, such people can be attracted to the Brahman because it seems plausible. There's a kind of philosophical plausibility there. But when you begin to hear about the pastimes of the Supreme, then suddenly you realize that being a human, being an individual, having senses, is not a mistake. It's not a problem that we have to get rid of, like the Buddhists and the Mayavadis claim. It's not that we have senses that's a problem. It's that we're doing the wrong things with them is the problem. The senses are the actual nature of consciousness of a living being. I was listening to a lecture by Ravinder Sarup yesterday, and he made the point that what do we mean by a person? What do we mean by having a personal form? Persons mean senses. The Supreme has senses, and we have senses. To be a person means you have senses. If you didn't have any senses, no eyes, no ears, no mouth, no tongue, no skin, none of that, how could you be a person? If you didn't have any way to interact with the world around you, how could you be a person? So the Supreme is certainly aware of everything in great detail because he is everything in great detail. However, he also has senses, and he uses them the same way we might use our senses, though of course they are not restricted in the same way our senses are. So this impersonal, merging or becoming one with the Brahman is not really attractive. And I think most people who toy with impersonalism never stop to think about what it would be like to depersonalize forever. What would that be like? Is that any real different from death, Of course, we think that when we depersonalize, we would be God in full. But then again, there's something flat about that too. It's, besides being impossible, it doesn't give us anything to be attracted by. Any other question?
I have a question, Maharaj.
Yeah, Cynthia.
So are there just a bunch of souls lingering in the Brahma Jyoti? And how do they get out? Do they just stay there? Is there a way for them to get out? Or are they just there forever?
They don't stay there forever. That's the mercy of the Supreme. He allows them to stay there for a long time, as some of them do incredible austerities to go there. So if they've gone through all this trouble to go there, the Supreme Lord gives them the opportunity. All right, you wanted to go here. All right, stay there for a few billion years. Great, and then we'll check you out after a few billion years go by. But Prabhupada says, he often quotes this verse, Ye nye ravendaksha vimukta manina swayashtabhava avishuddha buddhaya aruya krichchena parampadam tata patanti adho nadrata yusmadangraya. That there are those who imagine themselves to be elevated, but they only imagine it. It's not, in fact, true. They fall down from their position in the Brahma Jyoti because they have not embraced your lotus feet. So Prabhupada usually describes, and he's described this the same way in many, many different places, that these impersonalists, they rant about how everything is Maya and only the Brahman is true, they usually have their saying, which is Brahma Satyam Jagan Mitya, that Brahman is Satya or truth, and Jagan Mitya, the material world, is false. He says they rail about this all the time and explain to everyone how the material world is false. But then they fall back down from the Brahmajyoti and engage in welfare activity and political activism. So these two things are the result of people who have kind of burned out on the Brahmajyoti and are coming back for some pastime. So before they were against personality and pastimes. Now they're kind of a little bit bored by whiting out in the Om out Brahmajyoti, and they come back to the material world and open hospitals and start political movements. So this is generally what happens. They patantiyata, they fall down. So you can't stay in the Brahmajyoti. I always think of the Brahmajyoti as the subway system for the spiritual material worlds. You know, you can go from the spiritual world to the material world, or from the material world to the spiritual world. But the Brahmajyoti is at the border. If you want to go to the spiritual world proper, you have to leave the Brahmajyoti. And so as a person goes there, say a impersonalist has a serious desire to merge in the Brahmajyoti, so they're getting on the subway system. And they stay there for some time, merged in the Brahmajyoti, until they're ready to come out. Then they come back from the subway. They go out somewhere in the material world. So at the time of the destruction of the universes, at that time, all the living entities go into the Brahman, and they remain there until the entire material universe is generated again. And then they come back out. Again, you know, they're taking a subway ride, you know, and just like many people in the subway, they tend to sleep for a while on the subway. So the during the time when the material universe is not generated, during the time when Mahavishnu is inhaled, then during that time, there's no place to go. So they're all merged in a nidra state, a unconscious state. Then when the material universes are expanded again, they're expanded again by the breathing of Mahavishnu, then they can come back out. And that's that dim halo, the vision of Vishnu, which allows them to come back into the material world. And eventually, when Brahma has created the planets and various types of bodies, they're ready to take up whichever body is the right one, according to their karma. And they start having pastimes again. So the Brahmajyoti is not a permanent place. You can't stay there forever. But you can certainly stay there for a long time. Hari. So one thing also else that I wanted to bring up in this verse is this idea. This is a very important idea, that the Supreme is the original object of all the senses. Right now, we're misusing our senses to point them at things that are outside of the spiritual world, point them at things that have nothing to do with Krishna. And Maya, the material energy, is giving us the opportunity and creating these various things that are not Krishna for our senses to be focused on. So the eyes are trying to see wonderful forms that have nothing to do with Krishna. The ears are trying to hear wonderful sounds that have nothing to do with Krishna. The tongue is eager to taste various foods that are not offerable or not offered to Krishna. And the nose is eager to smell things that have nothing to do with Krishna. And in this way, the senses are competing with one another. And in this way, we find no real deep happiness or satisfaction in the material world. But once we connect the senses back to their original object, which is Krishna, we can see him, we can hear him, we can smell him, we can taste him, all these things we can do. And in this way, when we are connected back to Krishna, then our senses are meeting their original objects, and everything's right. And eventually we will leave the material world and go back to the spiritual world. That's the purpose of our senses. Any further discussions or questions?
Maharaj,
Mm-hmm.
I know you said that this, the Supreme Lord has pastimes. By hearing or knowing of these pastimes, one can get salvation or return to the spiritual world. Is the process of learning of his pastimes, is that what changes our consciousness that leads to salvation?
Yeah. It's a twofold process. One thing that's there is that we are learning about who Krishna is. We are understanding his powers, his beauty. We're understanding his attractive nature. We're understanding his fame. We're understanding how strong he is. So these are kind of aspects of Krishna that we are beginning to learn about. However, there's another side to it, and that is that we are gradually becoming attracted to Krishna, which has nothing to do, in one sense, about learning about all these opulences. It's quite a different thing. But before we can be attracted by his real nature, then we have to understand his glories, his material excellences. And that's what the difference is between, in one sense, the Vaidhi or Vidhi Bhakti and the Raganuga or Ragatmika Bhakti. So Prabhupada did mention in the very beginning of this purport today that there are those who love Krishna or have a great attraction to him. He mentioned them, and they are the ones who are perfected or purified souls. They're in Raganuga or Ragatmika Bhakti. They're spontaneously attracted to the Supreme. But as Prabhupada mentioned in the very first part of the verse today in the purport, he mentioned that there are others who are following rules and regulations to gain that attraction. And for them, they have to be aware of Krishna's various opulences, of his excellences. And so they are first kind of informed of the amazing qualities of the Supreme. They're first informed. And then later on, if they continue the practice of Krishna consciousness, this will fade away. In fact, in Goloka Vrindavan, all the residents there could care less about Krishna's excellences or his opulences. That means absolutely nothing to them. They're not at all intrigued or interested by that. They're interested in his sweetness. They're interested in his relationships with him. And they've forgotten about all that. So it's a two-step process. In the beginning, it's very important for us to learn about the qualities and opulences of the Supreme. But in the end, as we get further along in Krishna consciousness, these things play less and less a role. Instead, we are just directly experiencing Krishna and experiencing various emotions and attractions to him based on the way he does things. So, the material world is an unusual, mysterious, very complicated place. And because it's such a complicated place, it's not hard to see why people are bewildered by it and why they have so many misconceptions about it. We look at the world and we don't know what to pay attention to first. And it's the same way with the scientists. They're looking at the world, but they don't know what to pay attention to first. And they go down some rabbit hole. They investigate some aspect of the material world. Maybe they come up with some genuine understanding, some genuine patterns in the material world, the way some aspect of it works. All right. Sometimes they come up with false or incomplete or imperfect understandings of the way the material world works. But even if we say, for the sake of argument, they come up with some that are correct, the understanding of the material world that they understand or that they examine, is it relevant and important? It may certainly be true. It may certainly be accurate. But is it the most important aspect of the material world, which is where spiritual life makes a distinction, that there are all kinds of knowledge we could bother getting, but some points or some aspects of knowledge are not particularly interesting, useful, and certainly are not the thing that we would try to gain first. If you have a basic understanding of who you are and what this material world is and your position in the material world, if you have a basic understanding, then all right, these other kinds of knowledge are not going to get in your way. They're not going to be a problem for you. But if you don't have that basic understanding, no matter what else you understand about the universe, what mathematical formulas or principles you might know, whatever patterns you might perceive, even if they're accurate, whatever detail you may be able to give us about how the universe is going on, all these things are of little value to you or to anybody else. And often, these things are what cloud us and what waste our time to understand what the real aspect of the universe is and what's actually important. So our world is set up this way, that many people look at the world and they do genuinely figure out some details about how it's going on. But those details aren't important details. The important details are handled by the Vedic literature and by hearing from authorities. And so this idea of listening about Krishna's pastimes, listening about his philosophy, listening about his qualities, listening about his emotions, listening about his various explanations of philosophy, all these things are what purify us, and we are then delivered from various misconceptions. All right. Any final realizations or questions from anybody out there before we close up shop today on Wednesday, the 15th of July?
Maharaj, I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Even though some people know about Krishna, his form, his quality, and everything, sometimes you see they drift apart. They're drifting away from Krishna.
Right.
Is it something that are they affected by that because Krishna doesn't want them, or I don't know.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Oftentimes I think it's kind of interesting to try to understand why it is that sometimes people come to Krishna consciousness and why they sometimes seem to drift away. In the larger picture, we know that eventually they will return to Krishna consciousness. That's just the way the universe works. That once you have actually understood at any time in your succession of lifetimes, if you've understood at any time who and what the Supreme really is and the goal of devotional service, you will at some point in the future come back to it, because nothing else will do the trick, nothing else will fill the bill, nothing else will make you feel satisfied. However, you can drift away from it for a time. That's certainly possible, and people do that. And in fact, we do witness that. So why does it happen? Sometimes it happens because people are not actually following the process. They are interested in Krishna consciousness, but they are not able to actually follow the process of Krishna consciousness. And that's one of the things that causes people to drift away, even though they may have spent time in Krishna consciousness. And the most likely thing, though, that pulls people out of Krishna consciousness is a very simple thing, and that is offenses. That Krishna, he loves the devotees, as he says, the devotees are always in my heart, and I'm always in the heart of my devotees. So there's a love relationship between Krishna and his devotees, and it's a direct relationship because Krishna can be open with the devotees, where he cannot be open with those who are demonic, and he cannot be open with those who really are not interested in him. So for the devotees, he has a very intimate and very pleasant relationship. But when someone, even if they happen to be a devotee, is causing pain to the devotees in some way or another, when he's blaspheming them or hurting them or abusing them in some way, then Krishna can't tolerate that. So Krishna gets them to leave. How does he do that? He removes the protection that he gives from the modes of nature, and he removes the taste that keeps people involved in devotional service. And you may be running down the highway in devotional service, and you may have been doing it for many years. But once your taste is gone, and once you are not protected against the material energy, then you're easy pickings. And the material energy convinces you of some material thing that you must do. And usually the material energy convinces you that devotees are wasting their time, and you're wasting your time by being with them, and that they have many faults, and that people who are not devotees are actually of much better character, and you should leave and be with those other people. So you may think that you are actually becoming aware of all the faults of devotees in devotional service, and now you're leaving it behind. But actually, Krishna is pushing you out the back door by giving you those kind of impressions so that you will not further cause discomfort and pain for devotees. You will not abuse them any further, and therefore you leave. And that goes on for some time. But eventually, when a person leaves devotional services, they're miserable. At least in a very basic way, they're miserable. And sometime later, they will feel the intense desire to try to get back into devotional service. And so they will come back. All right, so some...
Thank you, Maharaj.
Hare
Thank you.
Krishna, very, very nice questions. And we thank you all very much for your attendance and for trying to understand some aspect of Bhagavatam. And as we go through this, we'll talk more about the details of material creation, and we'll talk about this process of devotional service. So thank you all very much, and we will
Thank you,
end at
Maharaj.
this
Hare
point.
Krishna.
Hare
Thank you so
Krishna.
much.
Thank you, Maharaj. Hare Krishna.
Hare
Thank
Krishna.
you, Maharaj. Haribo.